The sun was already low when Henry Boone finished raking the last row of pine needles behind the chapel. He didn't check the time. He never needed to. The long shadows told him more than any clock could. He picked up the metal rake, its wooden handle worn smooth where his hands had gripped it every evening for the last 7 years, and leaned it against the fence. That part of the cemetery called Hollow's Rest by the locals hadn't had a new burial in 3 winters. Most of the family plots were from the previous century, carved in stone too weathered to read, but Henry raked it anyway. It was what he did, even when no one came to see. The wind carried the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the valley, someone had started their fire early. Henry didn't wave. No one waved back. That was fine. His cabin stood 50 yards from the chapel, a squat one-room building with a tin roof and a porch just big enough for one man in his boots. He walked to it like he did every night, shoulders slightly forward, not out of pain, but habit. There was a rhythm to his days, quiet and unspoken, like an old song only he remembered. At the porch steps, he paused. The porch light had been flickering lately. He'd meant to fix it for weeks, but something about its hesitant glow made him leave it alone. It blinked like a tired eye trying to stay open. He turned it on anyway. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine cleaner and dust. A kettle sat cold on the stove, waiting for its nightly ritual. He lit the burner, filled it halfway, and sat at the table. On the wall above the table hung a faded photograph, a woman with dark hair and laugh lines at the edges of her mouth. She wasn't smiling in the picture, but Henry always imagined she had just finished. He didn't look at it long. He never did. Just enough to say, "I know you're still here," and then back to the stove. When the kettle hissed, he poured water into a chipped blue mug, added 1 spoonful of instant coffee, and stirred without thinking. It tasted like metal and old habits. Outside, the last light of day painted the cemetery in long strokes of gold and gray. The trees beyond the fence had started to drop their leaves. Each gust of wind sent down a small storm of color. He watched the breeze ripple through the grass between the headstones. They looked like teeth in a sleeping jaw, crooked, forgotten, but still holding on. This was the time of day Henry liked best, when everything seemed to hold its breath for a moment, like even the dead were listening. He sat in the old rocker, one arm repaired with a mismatched piece of cedar, and let it creak under his weight. The chair groaned but held. It always did. Some nights he'd hum an old tune, soft and aimless, not for anyone else, but because silence could grow too loud. Tonight, though, he was too tired. A squirrel darted across the fence, vanished. Then came stillness again. And then, just as the sun slid below the ridge, a sound. It was faint. A tap? No, a scrape. Henry turned his head. The chapel behind the main lot was locked, he was sure of it. He had checked the doors that morning like always, but the sound came again. Soft, rhythmic, almost intentional. He stood, not rushed, just curious. The last time he'd heard something strange at dusk, it had turned out to be a fox caught in a rusted gate. The time before that, a branch blown against the window. But this felt different. Henry walked slowly toward the chapel, his boots brushing fallen needles. The porch light flickered behind him, casting his shadow across the uneven ground. He didn't grab a flashlight. He didn't speak. He just listened. And as he stepped into the cool air behind the chapel, toward the tool shed where no one went anymore, he saw it. A pair of small shoes, pointed wrong, like someone had left in a hurry or never stood up at all. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a long moment, coffee cooling in his hand, breath misting in the autumn air. The wind shifted. The porch light buzzed behind him, and somewhere not far off came the sound again. A quiet knock from within the hollow hill. Not a warning, not a cry, a request. By morning, the strange sound had faded into silence, as if the earth itself had swallowed it whole. Henry didn't mention it in his notebook. He had an old ledger he used to record fallen branches, broken gates, and odd things like animal prints in fresh snow. But not this. Not yet. Some things needed more than a page to make sense. The wind had picked up. Yellow leaves danced across the path as he walked toward the back fence with a rusted hammer in hand. The cedar rocker on the porch had cracked again, same spot as last winter. He could have tossed it long ago. Replacing it would have been easier. But the chair mattered. He placed it gently on its side, knelt beside it. The splintered arm looked worse this time. The screw had come loose, the cedar patch had warped from rain. Still, he ran his hand along the grain, measuring the damage with his palm like his father used to do. He didn't rush. Repair was a kind of remembering. As he worked, the world around him stayed quiet. Just the tap of his hammer, the breath of the breeze, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel overhead. This was what he liked. Tasks that didn't ask for words. After nearly an hour, the rocker stood upright again. It wobbled a little but held. He wiped his hands on his jeans, reached for his coffee lukewarm now, and moved to sit. But just before he did, he noticed something in the grass. A small object half buried in fallen leaves, no bigger than his fist. He squinted, bent down. It was a mitten, child-sized. Faded blue with a frayed string still attached. Like it had once been clipped to a coat, no markings, no name. Henry turned it over in his hand. The fabric was damp, still soft. Not old, not weather-worn. His eyes shifted. A few feet away, near the edge of the chapel's shadow, lay a second mitten red this time. Mismatched. Tiny. He stood slowly, heart steady but eyes sharp now. The wind stirred again. Somewhere near the chapel's tool shed, something moved. He stepped toward it carefully, without sound. Past the back of the chapel, down the short incline where the stone path gave way to loose dirt. He crouched behind the pile of broken fencing he'd been meaning to clear. There it was again. Not movement, but proof. A small thermos. Pink. Tucked beneath a log. The kind a kid might carry in a lunchbox. Henry didn't pick it up. He just looked around. If there was a child out here, they hadn't left in a hurry. These weren't scattered. They were placed, left behind with intent, hidden maybe, or stashed for return. He scanned the tree line above the cemetery. Nothing moved. No flash of color, no voices, just wind. But the feeling stayed. Not fear, not suspicion, presence. Something or someone was close, had been close, maybe still was. He walked the perimeter again, checked the chapel doors, locked just as they had been. Peeked inside the shed-only tools, dust, old tarps. Back at the cabin, he set the mittens on the porch railing beside the patched rocker. He didn't wash them, didn't bag them or make any calls. He simply placed them where they could be seen. And that night, when the sun dipped behind the ridge and the light turned silver and low, Henry turned on the porch lamp again. It buzzed, flickered, stayed lit. He sat in the repaired chair, let it creak beneath him, and waited. Not for answers, just in case someone was trying to come back for what they'd lost. It was the scraping sound again. Same rhythm, same time. Henry heard it just after dusk, when the trees no longer held their color and the wind settled into stillness. He stood on the porch, one hand resting on the railing where the mittens still lay. The porch lamp buzzed faintly behind him. This time he didn't hesitate. He crossed the grass slowly, boots brushing against the fallen needles, ears tuned to every shift of air. The sound wasn't loud. It was the kind of noise that disappeared if you tried too hard to listen. Behind the chapel, the old tool shed leaned against the hillside, half covered in ivy. Beside it was a hollow space carved into the earth years ago, once used as a cold cellar, now long forgotten. A few boards leaned over its mouth like broken teeth. The noise came from there. Henry stepped closer. No flashlight, just his breath and the faint glow of the porch light behind him. He crouched low, moving the boards aside. The scent hit him first, damp wool, old leaves, and something faintly sweet like dried fruit. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw them. 4 children, curled together like fox kits, no blanket, no bags, no light, just coats and limbs tangled tight. They didn't startle, didn't scream. One lifted her head, a girl maybe 7 or 8, hair knotted, eyes dark but calm. She looked at him as if she'd expected him to come. The others stirred. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3, clung to the side of the oldest boy, whose arm was wrapped protectively around them all. Henry didn't speak. Neither did they. He counted their faces. 4, all pale, none visibly injured. But their cheeks were raw from wind, and their hands, curled tight, told him more than words ever could. He lowered the board back gently, like closing the lid of something fragile. He walked back to the cabin, slow and even, poured warm water into a pan, found the extra towels from the drawer under his bed, laid them by the stove, one by one, then stoked the fire until it crackled sharp. Then, without a word, he returned to the hollow. They were still there, still watching. He didn't ask where they came from. He didn't ask their names. He just held out a hand. The girl moved first, standing with slow precision, brushing leaves from her coat. She looked behind at the others. A slight nod. They followed. They walked to the cabin in silence, shoes soft on the moss path, only the firelight moving in the window ahead. Inside, Henry showed them where to sit. They didn't hesitate. He handed out towels. One by one, they wrapped themselves like travelers on the last train home. He heated a pot of canned soup, filled 4 cups, and gave them spoons. No one asked what kind. No one said thank you. But they ate like they hadn't eaten in days, careful, quiet, deliberate. When they finished, the oldest boy helped the youngest climb onto the cot by the window. The girl sat cross-legged near the stove, hands tucked into her sleeves. The 4th, a wiry boy with a nose too big for his face, fell asleep sitting up. Henry didn't try to speak. He just watched the fire dim, the kettle hiss, and the 4 of them breathe in sync with the house. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it wasn't fear either. It was something else, something like trust, or the beginning of it. The cabin felt too small for 5. Henry stood by the stove, arms crossed, watching the 4 children find spaces where no spaces had ever been. They didn't ask for anything, didn't cry. They moved like they knew how to disappear without leaving. He reached for the phone twice, picked it up, looked at it, then set it down, each time slower than the last. There was no signal this deep in the hollow. Not unless he hiked up the ridge. But the landline still worked. The sheriff's office would send someone, ask the usual questions. He stared at the handset for a full minute. Then, as if on cue, the youngest let out a cough. Dry, small, not dangerous, but enough to pull his attention away from the phone and toward the cot. The boy had curled into a ball, towel bunched under his chin, eyes shut but not sleeping. Henry sighed. He put a kettle on again, added a spoon of honey to a chipped cup, and steeped the only tea he had left, something chamomile-flavored he'd found in a care box last Christmas. He didn't ask if the child liked it. He just knelt, offered it, and watched small hands take it with practiced caution. The boy sipped slowly, carefully, as if the warmth might vanish if he drank too fast. Henry stood again. He didn't know what to do with children, had never had any of his own. His wife Clara had wanted them, but time passed. Then her health failed, and by the time either of them spoke the word out loud, it already felt too late. He looked around the room. One kid had folded a towel and used it as a pillow on the floor. Another had claimed the rocker, knees to chest, gaze fixed on the embers in the stove. They weren't trying to take space, they were trying not to. Henry walked to the cupboard, found a can of peaches, opened it, then another, laid out 5 spoons on the table, then 5 forks, just in case. He didn't know what kids used for peaches. He placed the open cans on a plate like it was a meal. It wasn't. But it was sweet and soft and easy to eat. No one moved. He cleared his throat, nodded toward the table. The girl stood first, quietly. The others followed. They ate like before, carefully, not greedily. The oldest boy made sure the youngest got the soft slices without the tough bits near the edge. Henry noticed. He poured himself a cup of water, sat on the edge of his bed, and watched. Still not a word, not one name spoken. When they finished, the girl gathered the empty cans and placed them in the sink. She didn't wash them, but lined them up neatly like she had somewhere else. A habit from before. Henry glanced at the phone again. Just one night, he thought. Let them sleep. Let them warm up. No sense in hauling 4 kids out into the dark just to sit under fluorescent lights and answer questions from men who didn't listen. Morning would come. Then he'd figure it out. He grabbed a spare blanket, the thick one he used in February storms, and laid it over the 2 smallest side by side on the cot. He placed a second folded towel under the boy still curled in the rocker. Then, without saying anything, he turned off the overhead bulb, left the porch light on, and eased into the chair outside. The sky above the ridge was scattered with stars, cold, bright, steady. Henry let the rocker move beneath him, slow and quiet. Behind him, inside the cabin, 4 strangers were breathing the same air, sharing the same space. It shouldn't have felt right, but it didn't feel wrong either. The morning broke slow and gray, no bird song, just wind. Henry stepped outside with his mug, steam rising in the cold. He hadn't slept, he didn't expect to. The cabin was too quiet when children were sleeping inside. He stood on the porch, listening. Behind him, the floor creaked. The girl, the one who had watched him the night before without fear, stepped out barefoot. She held something swollen metal in her hands. A tin box. Rusted edges, floral print almost rubbed away. She clutched it like it weighed more than it looked. Henry didn't speak. He just waited. She walked past him, down the 2 porch steps, and sat cross-legged on the cold wood. Then wordlessly she opened the box. Inside, folded scraps of paper, some lined, some torn from old books. A few wrapped with string, all written in pencil. She picked one and handed it to him. He hesitated, then took it. The handwriting was small and looping, a little shaky but intentional. The words were arranged in stanzas, not quite poems, not quite riddles. The first line read, "If stones could speak, they'd whisper names in crooked rows and weathered frames." Henry read it twice. The next verse was stranger. "Behind the chapel, near the yew, where roots grow deeper than you knew." He looked at her. She was staring at the edge of the woods. "How many are there?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, just pulled out another slip. This one had water damage, the ink smudged at the corners. The lines were harder to read, but still they rhymed. Still they hinted. Burial places, old names, descriptions of trees, fences, shadows, nothing direct, but layered, careful. Messages meant for someone who knew how to listen. Henry set the paper down. "Who gave you these?" The girl looked at him then, really looked. Not with fear or caution, but with something older, like she'd already seen this moment in a dream. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted the box, placed it in his lap, and stood. He watched her walk barefoot back into the cabin. Quiet, composed, like she hadn't done anything important at all. Henry sat there a long time. The steam from his coffee had gone cold. The wind picked up, catching the edge of one of the papers, flipping it like a leaf. He reached into the box again. A third poem. The woman who walks but leaves no track, knows every stone and won't look back. He read the last line aloud, almost without meaning to. She waits where no one dares to go. Her silence is the only show. He looked up. The ridge beyond the cemetery stood quiet, lined with skeletal trees. No figure today, no motion, but someone had written these. Not children, not by themselves. Someone had taught them how to remember things in rhyme. Someone wanted them to be found, or wanted something found through them. Henry folded the poem carefully, placed it back inside the box, and closed the lid. His hands rested on the tin like it might vanish if he let go. Inside, 4 children were eating toast, still too quiet for kids their age. Outside, the frost on the grass began to melt. And from somewhere in the hills, the wind carried a sound he couldn't name. Half breath, half echo. He didn't know it yet, but that box would change everything. By the end of their 3rd day in the cabin, the children had started moving like they belonged. Not loudly, not selfishly, just there. One washed the dishes after each meal without being asked. Another straightened the towels. The youngest lined up their mismatched shoes along the porch, smallest to largest. Henry didn't say much. He still hadn't asked their names, but he noticed. That morning he brought them out with him. Not to keep them busy, not to teach them anything. Just because the sun had finally come out, and the woods were warmer than they'd been in weeks. He gave them each a rake, showed them how to clear pine needles off the stone paths between grave rows. They nodded, took the tools, and got to work. It wasn't normal, but it felt right. Henry worked a few yards away, near the southern edge of the cemetery where the graves were oldest. Most of the names had faded. Time had rubbed away the edges of letters until only shapes remained. Some stones were broken, others crooked, leaning like tired shoulders. That's when he heard it. A voice. The girl. Thomas A. Merritt, born 1861, died March 9, 1932. Henry turned. She stood in front of one of the oldest headstones, just a worn slate slab with a crack down the middle. The name was barely visible. Most of the date had long since vanished. He walked over, squinting at the stone. "You can read that?" he asked. She looked up, not smug, not surprised, just calm. "It's in the poem," she said. The oldest boy stepped beside her. "Page 3, 2nd verse." Henry blinked. "You memorized all those poems?" The boy shrugged. "That's how she taught us." "She?" No answer. The girl crouched beside the stone, brushing off a layer of dirt. "He was a carpenter, fell off a roof fixing the church steeple. It's in the story." Henry felt a weight settle in his chest. He stared at the stone again, this time really looking. The carving was so worn it could have said anything. And yet somehow they knew. Not just names, not just dates, histories. He scanned the rows nearby. More forgotten markers, more fading, more silence. "How many stories do you know?" he asked, softer now. "All the ones that rhyme," the boy said. There was no pride in it, just fact. Henry walked a few steps away, trying to hide the sudden tightness in his throat. He'd worked here for years, cleaned these stones. Knew the layout better than his own childhood street. But even he hadn't known that man's name. He would have said it was illegible. And yet these children who'd never lived here, never been told, could speak the graves back to life. He turned back. "Who taught you all this?" The girl stood up. "Someone who had to leave." Henry opened his mouth to ask more, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Not fear, not secrecy, just protection. Like she was holding something she wasn't sure he was ready to carry. The wind shifted. Dry leaves scraped across the stone. Henry looked down at the path under his boots, thought of how many names he'd walked past, never really seeing them. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, voice flat but not cold. "Finish this row, then we'll go inside. You'll tell me more, one story at a time." The girl nodded. The boy grinned. The youngest, still clutching the broken rake, looked up and asked, "Do we get soup?" Henry almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "You get soup." That night, long after the children had gone quiet, Henry stayed up. He wasn't restless, not exactly, just aware. Like the silence wasn't just absence of sound, but something waiting. He sat at the table, papers spread out before him. The poems from the tin box now unfolded, smoothed with the edge of his hand. He'd read them twice already, then a third time, not to find meaning, but to feel the rhythm. There was a pattern in them, not just rhyme, direction, landmarks disguised in metaphor, names buried in cadence. And the handwriting, it looked familiar, not in memory but in muscle. He'd seen it before, he was sure. Somewhere older than the tin. He stood, crossed the room and crouched by the hearth. The floorboards in that corner had a slight give. He'd meant to fix it once, never did. Some things weren't broken enough to demand attention. But tonight, it called to him. He wedged the claw of his hammer beneath the edge, lifted gently. The wood creaked, dry and stubborn, but came free with a breath of dust, inside a shallow space lined with faded cloth, a few rusted nails, a cracked marble, and a book small, leather-bound, weathered from years underground. He pulled it out slowly, as if waking something. The cover was blank, the spine cracked when he opened it. Inside, notes, dates, weather. Odd facts about soil conditions and plant growth near graves. But woven between the pages, verses. Short, careful, each one like a puzzle. He flipped through. West of the gate, where lilies grow beneath the yew, there's more below. Another. To know the names that time erased, begin with stone, then count the space. The handwriting. It was the same. Henry sat back against the wall, ledger in hand. Heart thudding, slow but deep. He recognized the name written inside the front cover. Harlan Voss, groundskeeper, 1976-2009. Voss had held this job before Henry. He'd died of a stroke 2 years before Henry was hired. The man had worked this land for decades. Locals said he spoke little, kept to himself. But apparently he'd kept records and poems. The girl's words echoed in his mind. She taught us. But now he wondered. Maybe it wasn't a she, or maybe it was both. Maybe someone who knew this place had partnered with Voss, left behind more than tools and tasks. Henry turned a page. Near the back, a list, unmarked stones notes from oral history. Each entry had a small sketch beside it, and beside each sketch a rhymed couplet. The infant born but never named sleeps where shade and moss are claimed. The teacher buried in the rain, her chalk still whispers on the pane. They weren't just poems. They were maps in disguise. Story as memory, rhyme as resistance. He set the book down carefully. Someone had taught those children about this place, not as tourists, not as trespassers, as keepers. Henry rubbed his hands together, not from cold, but from something else. Reverence, or maybe responsibility. He looked toward the bed. The oldest boy had fallen asleep sitting up again, chin tucked to chest, hands still dirty from raking that morning. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random. Whoever had left them here knew this place, had chosen it. Henry stood slowly, placing the ledger beside the tin box on the table. He stared at the two objects. Different in shape, but bound by the same hand, same cadence, same invisible thread. Something or someone was trying to be found, and he had just begun to listen. It started on a Thursday. Henry noticed it while standing on the porch, same as every evening. Mug in hand, light flickering above him. The air crisp, sun low. At first he thought it was a tree, just a trick of shadow. A branch bent the right way, but then it moved. Just a tilt of the head, barely there but unmistakable, a figure, upright, still, positioned just above the tree line across the narrow valley where the woods thinned and the ridge curved. They were facing him, or more precisely facing the cemetery. Henry didn't react, didn't wave, just stared back. The figure made no sign. No motion, no sound. It stood there for maybe 10 minutes, then stepped backward into the trees, swallowed by the gray. The next day it returned. Same hour, same place, same stillness. Henry watched from the rocker, pretending not to care. But his grip on the mug betrayed him tight enough to leave a faint tremble in the ceramic. Again the figure left without a trace, and the next evening, it came back. Always at sunset, always alone. By the 5th day, Henry didn't pretend anymore. He stood facing the ridge as the light changed, waiting to see if they would come. They did. The children didn't ask. Maybe they didn't notice. Maybe they already knew. But Henry noticed. He studied the silhouette. Slight shoulders, long coat, not tall. The kind of posture that belonged to someone used to carrying weight not physically but inside. Something about that shape, the way it stood quiet, watchful, pulled at him. He didn't feel threatened, just watched, but not in a way that made him uneasy, in a way that made him remember something he couldn't quite name. That evening, after the figure disappeared again, he walked to the cemetery's northern edge. From there, you could see the ridge clearly, at least in daylight. The trail was narrow, rarely used. Foxes lived in the underbrush. The wind shifted strangely at the crest. He looked for footprints, bent grass, anything. Nothing. The next morning, he returned to the same spot and found a single object left behind. A pine cone, wrapped in twine, balanced on a stone. It was nothing. It was everything. He didn't take it. He didn't touch it. Just stared at it for a long time. Back at the cabin, the girl watched him through the window, said nothing. The next sunset, the figure returned, as always silent, as always still. But this time, Henry didn't stay on the porch. He walked toward the cemetery gate, stood just behind it, arms crossed. The figure didn't move. Henry raised one hand, just slightly. A hello, a truce, or maybe a challenge. The figure didn't wave back, but they stayed longer that night. Until the last light slipped behind the hills, and for the first time Henry felt something he hadn't in years. Not fear, not curiosity, recognition. The cabin was quiet again, fire low, children asleep. Henry sat at the kitchen table, the tin box in front of him, unopened. His hand rested beside it, not quite touching. Like he needed its presence, but not its weight. Outside, the porch light hummed. The same old bulb that had buzzed for years, still working, still trying. He looked at it through the window, watched how it cast a soft circle on the porch boards. It used to mean something. It used to be hers. Clara had insisted on keeping the porch light on every night, even when they lived farther up the mountain where no one ever came by. In case someone's lost, she'd say, even if they're just lost inside. Henry had never argued, just changed the bulb when it dimmed, brushed the cobwebs away come spring. She was always the one watching from the porch, waiting, not worried, just there. He remembered the way she'd stand, shoulders slightly tilted, tea towel still in her hands, looking out into the dusk as if expecting someone, even when no one was due. He remembered the night he came home late after getting stuck helping old Lester pull a calf out of a fence. His clothes were covered in mud and apologies. But there she was, standing in the doorway lit by the porch lamp. Arms crossed, smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. "You smell like barnwood and trouble," she said. He laughed, took off his boots before stepping up. She didn't kiss him, didn't scold, just handed him a hot plate and walked inside. She'd always been like that, gentle in ways most people didn't notice, steady without asking for attention. Then came the slow illness, the narrowing of days, and the night she asked him to promise softly, almost like a joke, "Even when I'm not here, leave the light on, will you?" He had, even when he moved to this place after the funeral. After the sorting of boxes, after the echoes stopped echoing, he'd kept that promise. Every night the porch light clicked on. It wasn't for her, it was for someone like her, maybe someone lost, maybe someone coming back, maybe just the memory of waiting. He rubbed his fingers together, remembering how small her hands had felt near the end. How she used to tuck one hand under his arm when she was too tired to walk fast. He hadn't talked about her in years. No one had asked. And now there was a girl who read poems like passwords, a boy who guarded silence like it was treasure, and a stranger who stood at the ridge every dusk facing this place as if they knew what had been promised here. Henry stood slowly, walked to the door. The light above him buzzed again, faint, irregular. He looked toward the ridge, empty now, but the memory of the silhouette lingered, and in the soft circle of porch light he imagined Clara's shape beside him, arms crossed, towel in hand, not as a ghost, as a memory built from habit. He left the door ajar that night, just an inch, and for the first time in years the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like waiting. It had rained the night before, soft and steady, the kind of rain that didn't roar but lingered just enough to darken the soil and slow down time. By morning, the air smelled like bark and stone. Henry was outside checking the tool shed roof, where a few shingles had come loose when the girl approached. She walked quietly, a folded paper clutched tight in her hand. He didn't notice her at first. Then, without a word, she reached up and held the paper out toward him. It was damp at the corners. The fold creased neatly. Familiar. Another poem. Henry climbed down from the stool, took it without speaking. She didn't stay. Just turned and walked back toward the cabin, boots barely making a sound on the wet path. He waited until she was inside before unfolding the page. The handwriting was the same, but the tone felt different. He read it aloud under his breath, one line at a time. She grows where no one dares to look, beneath the stone beside the brook. He paused. There was a brook behind the chapel, dried most of the year, but after last night's rain, it would be running again. Her hair was earth, her breath was leaves, her silence deeper than the eaves. The words were careful, chosen, not just rhyme for rhyme's sake. She waits where roots are thick and wide, the kind you feel but cannot find. He folded the paper slowly, hands still. Something about the phrasing hit him low in the chest, not just the language, the knowing. He looked toward the ridge. The figure hadn't appeared since the last rain, but he could still feel the weight of those eyes on him. Not menacing, just tethered, as if someone was holding on to the edge of something they couldn't step into. Back in the cabin, the kids were drying their socks by the fire. The oldest boy helped the youngest pull a sweater over his head. The girl sat near the wall, watching the window, waiting for nothing in particular. Henry stepped inside, placed the poem on the table. "Where did you get this one?" he asked her, voice low. She looked at the paper but didn't reach for it. "She left it," she said simply. "Who?" No answer. Henry pulled out a chair, sat. "She your mother?" The girl didn't flinch, didn't blink. "Sometimes." That word sat heavy in the air. He tried again. "Is she alive?" She nodded. "Does she live out there? In the woods?" Another nod, slow. "For how long?" The girl traced the grain of the table with one finger. "Since before the storm." Henry remembered the storm she meant. 2 years ago, flash floods, a landslide that cut off half the ridge road. No one had been reported missing from this county that week, but people in the hills didn't always get reported. "She ever come close?" he asked. The girl shrugged. "She watches, she listens." Henry tapped the paper once, gently. "And the poems?" "She said they'd help us remember in case we forget who we are." Henry leaned back. This wasn't just someone passing through. This was someone who'd rooted herself into the land. Someone who didn't want to be found but couldn't bear being completely lost. He thought of the ledger, of Harlan Voss, of the matching handwriting, of the stories buried under rhyme. Maybe she hadn't just left the kids behind. Maybe she'd left herself piece by piece inside each line. A kind of breadcrumb trail, not to run, but to return. Henry looked out the window again. The ridge sat quiet, mist crawling low across its crown. "She ever try to speak to me?" he asked quietly. The girl looked at him finally. "She left you the light." Henry blinked. "What?" "She said the man with the porch light always on would understand." He didn't speak, couldn't. He just stared at the paper. And for the first time since Clara died, he felt something tremble in the hollow beneath his ribs. Not grief, not duty, recognition. The poem had been bothering him all day. Not the words themselves, not the images, the structure. Henry had read it half a dozen times by breakfast, then again after lunch, walking the perimeter of the cemetery with it folded in his coat pocket. There was something about it, an intentional rhythm, a logic behind the verse. Like the rhyme wasn't decoration, it was organization. By late afternoon, he brought the poem back to the table and started breaking it apart. 4 stanzas, each one with a matching syllable count, internal echoes, consonant pairs, line breaks that matched compass directions if you read them spatially. This wasn't just poetry. It was pattern. Henry reached for the ledger Harlan Voss had left behind. He flipped through the back pages, those cryptic entries, the verses, the underlined names. He found one that echoed the latest poem, where roots twist like questions beneath the used suggestion. A memory buried low, where only listeners go. He grabbed a pencil, drew lines between the entries, looked at distances between stones in the south row. Then something clicked. This was mapping language, not poetic, tactical. He'd seen something like this before. Not recently, years ago, decades. Back in the late 80s when Clara worked part-time at the VA hospital downstate, she used to come home with letters, never addressed to her but always included in care packages from patients. They were hand-copied poems, some just fragments. She'd read them aloud, called them riddles for the mind that won't stop moving. One name had stood out, Tess Calder. Clara used to speak that name with a kind of reverence. "She sends real gifts," she once said. "Not just socks and gum, she sends time, written into verse." Henry hadn't thought of Tess in years, but now he did. Hard. Because tucked into one of those letters, a rare one that Clara never let him throw away, was a couplet that matched the cadence exactly. He rummaged through the old drawer near the stove. Papers, maps, half-used notebooks. Then at the back, wrapped in a cloth napkin, he found it. A letter dated 1994. VA return address. Inside, one folded poem, signed in a tight, even hand, T.C. He laid it next to the one the girl had given him. Same hand, same spacing, same structure. His throat tightened. Whoever Tess Calder was, she hadn't just sent letters. She'd trained memory to survive in rhyme. She'd embedded meaning in rhythm. She'd written for people who could no longer say things aloud. Clara had once called her a ghost with a purpose. And now, somehow, Tess or someone taught by her had raised these children, hidden them with poems, and chosen this cemetery as the last breadcrumb. Why here? Why him? He read the new poem again. "She grows where no one dares to look." He whispered it now, then looked at the map again. If he was right, the poem wasn't just describing the land. It was pointing to it, like coordinates hidden in metaphor. He drew a line from the oldest gravestone to the yew tree near the creek bed, where the roots ran deep, where even Voss had avoided digging. And suddenly he remembered. The last Christmas Clara was alive, a small package had arrived, no return address. Just a card tucked inside that read, "To the one who keeps the light on, you never close the door." They'd thought it was a church friend, maybe someone from the support group. But now, that phrase, that handwriting, it had been the same hand. T.C. Henry sat back. The porch light flickered behind him, humming softly. And now, Tess wasn't just a name from a letter. She was real. She was near. And she had left more than poems. She had left a trail home. The rain had softened the path behind the chapel, turning dirt to silence beneath Henry's boots. He carried the poem in his pocket, still folded once like a letter that hadn't yet decided who it was meant for. He'd spent the night rereading it, tracing every metaphor like a wire in an old wall. And sometime around dawn he knew where to go next. The chapel hadn't been used in years. It leaned into the hillside like a man too tired to keep standing. Ivy claimed the north side, and the bell had long since rusted silent. But the frame still held, still kept secrets. Henry pried the old lock open with the same key Voss had left in a tin behind the tool shed. He hadn't used it in ages, maybe never. Inside, dust floated in shafts of light through high, stained glass slats. It smelled like paper and stone in a long-closed drawer. He walked past the pews, 2 rows of them, warped and splintered. At the far end, where the pulpit used to stand, the floor sagged under a loose board. That was where he started. He knelt and lifted it gently. Below, a shallow space lined with cedar planks. Not big, just enough room for 1 box and a folded cloth bundle. He reached inside. The first thing he found was a folded map paper yellowed with time, hand-drawn in charcoal. The layout of the cemetery was there, but over it, someone had added circles, notes, symbols not found on any official record. One circle was marked BR, another labeled 315 in a tight angular script. Beside the map lay a worn pouch. Inside, a silver wristwatch, old but intact. It wasn't ticking. Henry held it up. The hands pointed to 315 exactly. He turned it over in his palm. The strap was cracked but still supple. The crystal scratched. The kind of watch worn daily, not kept for style. He wound it gently. Nothing. He tapped it. Still no movement. Then he looked closer. Etched inside the backplate, almost too faint to see. T. Calder. He exhaled through his nose, sat back on his heels. So it was her. This was no longer theory, no longer guesswork. Tess Calder had been here, had hidden things here, had drawn maps by hand, left breadcrumbs in rhyme. And something had happened at 3:15, whenever that was. He stared at the map again. The circle labeled 3:15 was drawn right beside the edge of the dried creek bed, where the yew tree split into 2 trunks where the roots curved outward like fingers reaching. He had passed that place dozens of times. Cleared brush from it. Never thought it held anything. Now he wasn't so sure. He refolded the map, pocketed the watch, replaced the board, and stood. The chapel seemed quieter now, like it had exhaled something it had been holding. He stepped outside. And from the ridge, across the clearing, a shadow shifted behind the trees, no motion but presence. He didn't call out, just looked down at the watch in his hand, the hand still frozen, still pointing at the same moment. Whatever happened at 3:15, it hadn't passed. Not yet. He had just finished reburying the Bach. It had been shallow, tucked near the base of the U where the map said it would be. Inside, a bundle of photos wrapped in waxed cloth, black and white prints, worn at the corners. One showed Clara younger, laughing, hair pulled back, standing beside a woman with sharp eyes and a guarded smile. No names on the back, just a date. July 2004, Ridge Hill. Henry didn't need more. He knew who she was now, or at least who she had been. He stood, brushed soil from his hands, and turned to walk back. She was already there. standing 10 feet away, half in shadow, half in light, coat wrapped close, face still, the same shape he'd seen on the ridge every night at dusk, but now with detail. Not young, not frail, a woman built from years, not months, not a ghost, not quite. Henry didn't speak. Neither did she. Not at first. Wind stirred the edge of her sleeve. Somewhere overhead a hawk called and passed. Then quietly she asked, "Do you think they hate me?" No hello, no explanation, just that. Henry's throat tightened. He swallowed. He didn't answer right away. She didn't push. Her voice had no desperation in it, no tremble, only weight like someone holding up a roof without showing the beams. "They don't talk much," he said finally. She nodded, looked toward the woods, not at him. "They used to sing," she murmured. "All four of them, not in tune." "But loud." Henry glanced down. "You left them." "I hid them," she corrected. "Then I left." Silence. A moment passed, then another. He shifted his weight. "You wrote the poems?" "Yes." Tess called her. She tilted her head slightly, neither confirming nor denying. "That's what she called me, back when I had use for names." He pulled the watch from his pocket, let it dangle between them. "This stopped at 3:15. She looked at it for a long time, then, "That's when I buried the last thing I couldn't carry." "What was it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she said, "Clara kept the light on, even after she knew I wasn't coming." Henry felt something sharp in his chest, old but not cruel. "She believed you were still trying," he said. "I was," Tess said, "just not for the same door." They stood in silence again, this time not empty. The trees creaked above, light filtered through branches thin and gray-blue. She took one step closer, slow, still kept a few feet between them. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving them," she said. "I left because love wasn't enough, not then. Not when you're being hunted by the parts of yourself you can't name in court." Henry looked at her, really looked, not as a stranger, not even as a mother, as someone who had survived something no one prepared her for. "They don't hate you," he said quietly. She didn't react. "They don't know how to," he added. She closed her eyes just for a second, then opened them again and whispered, "Good." Then, almost like an afterthought, "I never wanted to be saved, just remembered." And with that, she turned and stepped back into the tree line, her coat brushing leaves that curled inward like fingers letting go. Henry didn't follow, didn't need to. The roots would tell him where she'd gone. That night, Henry didn't sleep. He made tea he didn't drink, straightened chairs that didn't need fixing, folded the same dish towel twice, then, without a word, he stepped onto the porch and left the door open a crack. Just an inch. The kind of opening you don't see unless you're looking for it. The porch light was already on, buzzing faintly. He sat in the rocker, same as always. The ridge was dark, silent, but he knew she was there, somewhere in the trees still watching. He didn't expect anything, didn't hope. He just waited. By morning, the light had gone cold in the bulb and the sun was pushing against the edge of the mist. He found it on the porch table, a folded paper still warm from a hand that had left only minutes ago. On the back, written in the same delicate hand as always, "When the door is open, I will not knock." He didn't read the rest, not yet. Instead, he turned and looked inside the cabin. The kids were already stirring. The youngest had somehow tangled himself in 2 blankets. The oldest girl stood at the stove, her posture careful. Just like Clara had once stood, unsure if she was allowed to make herself useful. Henry said nothing, just nodded. Let her be. Later that afternoon, he was in the field behind the cemetery checking the old fencing when he heard laughter. Real, full-bodied, unscripted laughter. He turned. The children were in the tall grass, chasing one another through bursts of wild clover. The boy who had once curled up like a question mark in the corner was now leaping toward the girl with the tin box, his arms outstretched. They were smiling, not carefully, not like they had borrowed the moment, but like they owned it. Henry stood still for a long time, and that was when he saw her, not far, not hidden. Standing beneath the elm, hands folded, face tilted toward the sound. Tess. She wore the same coat, same quiet, but her shoulders had lowered. Her jaw no longer clenched. She didn't step forward, didn't speak, just watched. Henry walked over slowly, no rush. When he reached her, he didn't greet her with questions, just said, "They're loud today." Tess gave a soft laugh, not bitter, not sad. "They used to be louder," she said. He nodded. They stood together side by side, not touching, not facing one another, watching the children. And for a long while that was enough. Then Henry said, "There's room, if you wanted to. Stay a little." Tess didn't respond right away. Instead, her eyes tracked the girl with the box as she ran laughing through the tall grass, tripping once and catching herself like she'd done it 100 times. "I won't stay forever," Tess said, voice barely above wind. Henry nodded again. "Didn't ask for forever." Silence. Then, as if choosing her words from a deep place, "I don't know how to come home." Henry looked at her now. Not pity, not even forgiveness, just knowing. "You don't have to," he said. "You just have to walk toward the light." She let out a breath, shaky but not broken. Then she turned, and together, without fanfare, they walked back toward the cabin. That evening, after the dishes were done and the children were quiet again, Henry stepped out to the porch. The light above hummed, constant, soft. He stood beside it for a moment, then reached up and changed the bulb. Not because it had gone out, but because this one needed to last longer. When he turned, Tess was sitting just inside the threshold, a mug in her hands, not looking at him, but not looking away either. And for the first time, the space between the doorway and the light wasn't a border. It was a beginning. The kitchen table hadn't seen a pen in months. It had held meals, quiet conversations, tin boxes, mismatched mugs. But this morning, it held a single sheet of paper, crisp and heavy. Legal paper, the kind that made silence stretch longer than it needed to. Tess sat across from Henry, sleeves rolled back, hands steady. She didn't read the paper twice, just once, top to bottom, then again in the middle, lips pressed in a straight line. Henry stood off to the side, arms crossed, not pacing, just there. The children were out back, helping rake leaves around the edge of the chapel. No one had told them what today was. Tess picked up the pen, signed her name. She didn't flinch, didn't ask for a copy, just looked up and said quietly, "This isn't me stepping out, it's me stepping beside." Henry nodded, said nothing. She added, "They already chose. I'm not here to rewrite that. I just don't want to disappear again." He slid the paper toward himself. "No one's erasing you." She gave a tight smile. "I erased myself. I just didn't realize how long it would take to come back." Outside, the wind shifted. Henry looked toward the window. He'd spent most of his life keeping things running, machines, fences, memory. But now, for once, he let something settle. Later that afternoon, he took the children to the southern edge of the cemetery. The stones weren't real, not in the way most people thought. They were old blanks set up long ago, never carved. Voss used them to teach new workers how to clean without cracking brittle edges. But to the children, they had always been theirs. They had named them in whispers, given stories to each. Now it was time to give them something truer. He brought his old carving set, the one he hadn't touched since Clara died, and one by one, with Tess watching from the path, not hovering, just present, he carved new names into those blank stones. Not last names, not legal names. Names the children chose, each one said aloud like a small promise. The youngest picked Finn, short and bright. The girl chose Malin, soft and strong. The older boy asked for Rowan, and the second youngest whispered Emery, almost too low to hear. Henry carved each letter slow and deep, not into headstones, into markers, not to remember what was lost, but to name what had been reclaimed. Tess stood quietly until the last name was done. Then she stepped forward not to touch the stones, but to kneel in front of them. One hand on the earth, one hand to her chest like a prayer without words. Henry stepped back. Let the moment belong to her. When she stood, she didn't look at him, just said, "Thank you for not asking me to explain." And Henry replied, "Thank you for not asking me to replace you." They walked back toward the cabin side by side. The sun was dipping low. The porch light hadn't turned on yet, but the door was open. And the children were already inside, sitting cross-legged on the floor, telling stories to each other in a language only they understood. As they stepped onto the porch, the bulb above them flickered once, then held, steady, like it had always been waiting for everyone to come home. The clearing behind the chapel had never been more than a patch of overgrown land, half shade, half sun, crowded with blackberry bramble and old stones that never found a name. But now it had purpose. They started calling it the garden, even before anything had been planted. It was the girl's idea first, Malin. She stood at the edge of the clearing one morning and said, almost to herself, "We should grow something that remembers." Henry didn't ask what she meant. He just handed her a spade and said, "Let's see where the dirt is soft." Over the next week, the 5 of them, 6, if you counted Tess, who mostly stayed quiet but never far worked the land, pulled weeds, dug small plots, cleared rocks, unearthed old buttons, broken glass, a toy truck buried under roots. Every evening the garden took shape, no straight lines, no symmetry, just patches of memory carved in the soil. Each child chose a place to plant something. Not just flowers, though there were those too, but symbols. Rowan planted lavender because it reminded him of the coat Clara once wore in an old photograph. Finn buried a toy compass, said it didn't work anymore but might still point to where we started. Emery picked forget-me-nots and asked if they were allowed to bloom wild. Malin took the stone from the base of her grave marker and placed it in the center of the garden. Said nothing, but stayed beside it for a long time. Then one night, as the sun dipped and the porch light clicked on, they asked a question that had no clear cue. "Can we choose our last name?" The question hung in the dusk. Tess looked up first, surprised. Henry didn't answer right away. The girl clarified, "Not to match anyone, just to match each other." No one said family, no one had to. Henry nodded slowly. "Long as it's yours," he said, "you can wear it." They spent the evening talking around the fire pit, no marshmallows, just embers and words. They tested names like tasting them in their mouths. Some were too sharp, some too floaty. Finally, it was Finn who said, "Bright." Silence. Then Rowan repeated it. Malin smiled. Emery whispered it once, then again. Bright. Not because it was flashy, but because it sounded like something you could carry. Like something that made sense coming out of the dark. Henry didn't say a word, just added another log to the fire. The next day, they carved it into a flat piece of cedar and placed it at the edge of the garden. The bright garden, for all who remember. No one claimed ownership. No one needed to. That night, Tess sat on the porch steps, arms around Malin, who had fallen asleep, leaning into her side. Henry stood beside the porch light, watching them both. "Bright," Tess said softly, as if still trying the name out. Henry didn't look at her, just replied, "Fitting." She nodded. "I couldn't give them much," she said, "but I'm glad they chose that, something that wasn't mine first." Henry finally turned to her, not smiling but not heavy either. "You gave them the part that counts," he said, "the part that listens." Tess looked down, then asked, "Do you think they'll remember this, years from now?" He watched the garden, where tiny green shoots were just starting to reach. "They won't have to," he said. "It'll remember them." Spring came quiet that year. No sudden bloom, no burst of green, just a slow thaw, like the land had been holding its breath all winter and finally remembered how to exhale. Henry felt it first in the ground, the way the soil stopped resisting his boots, the way birdsong crept in before sunrise, low and hesitant, like testing the air. It had been 3 months since Tess left. No note this time, no paper on the porch, just a soft goodbye at the garden edge, her hand resting lightly on Emery's shoulder, her eyes meeting Henry's with something that wasn't sadness. It wasn't relief either, just enough. She'd promised to send more poems if the kids still wanted them. They had nodded, but none had asked when. Now Henry stood outside the cemetery gate, eyeing the old arch. The wood had warped over the years, gray and soft at the edges. One side leaned inward like the whole thing was bowing under the weight of time. He ran his hand along the beam. Soft rot in places, a nail working loose. It didn't need to be perfect, just needed to hold. He spent the morning replacing the worst boards, reinforced the hinges, cleaned off the lichen from the old sign, even though the letters were nearly gone. Then from inside the shed he brought out a small iron lantern, blackened with use but still sound. Clara had bought it at a roadside sale years ago, said it was for late arrivals. He had never hung it, until now. He mounted it just above the gate, then wired it, ran the switch from the same line that fed the porch light. When he turned it on, the lantern glowed amber. Not bright, just enough. Enough to be seen from the ridge, enough to say, "Someone's here. You're not too late." Later that afternoon, the children helped him clean the stone paths. Malin tucked wild violets along the border. Rowan carried a rake with practiced arms. Finn trailed behind, dropping pebbles like breadcrumbs. Emery hummed to himself, low and tuneless, but full of something steady. The garden was waking. And so was the house. Inside the walls had more drawings now. The shelf above the stove held 4 mismatched mugs, each with a chipped edge claimed by a different hand. No one called it a family, but no one called it anything else either. As dusk settled, Henry stepped out to the porch. The light above the door clicked on, then across the yard, so did the lantern by the gate. He stood there a long while, arms crossed, breathing in the cold, clean air of a spring not quite here, not quite gone. He didn't expect anyone, but he had the light ready just in case. Behind him, the door opened. Malin leaned out. "Supper's ready." Henry nodded once. Still watching the road. "You think she'll come back?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just said, "If she does, she'll see the light." Malin looked at the lantern, then back at him. "She'll know it's for her?" Henry finally looked at her. "No," he said. "It's for anyone who needs it." He let that sit in the air a moment, then turned and followed her inside. The lantern stayed lit. The night fell soft. And somewhere in the hills a woman walked with a notebook in her coat and a poem half written in her head, toward nothing certain. But with the quiet knowing, she wasn't forgotten, not anymore. The sky was just beginning to lift, not bright yet, but no longer dark. Henry stepped outside with his usual mug half coffee, half habit, and felt the cold of the porch wood through his socks. The lantern by the gate was still glowing, soot and steady. Morning birds hadn't started yet, just wind and hush. Then he saw it. Footprints, small ones, pressed into the wet earth just past the gate, leading up, stopping. He walked over, careful not to disturb them. Right beneath the lantern, tucked against the wooden post, was a folded square of paper creased once, then again. Damp at the edges, no name, no mark. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just held it for a while. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Malin, still in her sleep shirt, sweater thrown over, stood there, blinking at the morning. She looked at him, then at the paper. Then she asked, quiet as the breeze, "What if she goes far again?" Henry didn't pretend not to know who she meant. He looked at the lantern, still glowing. She might. Malin nodded slowly. Her shoulders were smaller in the cold. Will she come back? He thought about it, then said, maybe not for long, maybe not in the way you want. She looked down, picked at a thread on her sleeve, then, so why do you keep the light on? Henry looked at her, not to answer, to make sure she was ready to hear it, then simply, because someone will need it. He didn't say who, didn't say when, just let the truth hang there, like breath in the cold. Malin looked at the footprints, then at the lantern. She stepped forward, placed her hand on the post, stood still, then whispered mostly to herself, "Then I will too." And Henry smiled, just a little, not because anything was fixed, but because something was now being kept. That night, when the sky slipped into blue-gray again, Henry lit the porch light as always, then stepped down the path, checked the wiring, and made sure the lantern at the gate still glowed. He adjusted its angle slightly, not because it needed fixing, but because someone out there might be trying to find it.